Today we're going to be in part 2 of a series looking at the story of Jonah. And if you were not with us last week, would love for you to be able to catch up. You can do that by going online to nonachurch.com, where we have all of our messages online, and you can grab that content there. You can watch what happened last week. But to catch you up on the story of Jonah, for those of us that weren't here and for those of us that need a quick refresher, Jonah is really this kind of story. Jonah is a not-so-feel-good, too close to home story of our rebellion and God's loving pursuit. And I love the story of Jonah because the story of Jonah is like a real story. It's not a once upon a time, lived happily ever after kind of story. The story of Jonah does not end with this kind of really beautiful ending, kind of moment. Stace and I watched a romantic comedy this weekend. We watched one and we thought it was super cute and super fun. And like every romantic comedy, it was really great until about 10 minutes into the end of the movie. The guy does something dumb, right? Because men are always the bad guys in romantic comedies, right? He does something dumb. She moves to another city, and he chooses to fly to that city to surprise her, right? And it's like, I have to have you in my life. And then it ends with like some song that's like an acoustic Sarah McLachlan song, right? And then everybody cries at the end, right? And that's how the movie ends, right? The story of Jonah is nothing like that, all right? The story of Jonah ends with God asking a question. We don't get an answer, and Jonah is not the hero in the story, all right? It's like a really, really true, raw, gritty kind of tale, and I love it. Jonah chapter 1 really is the storyline of what happens when you and I rebel against God, when you and I make decisions or choices that are against what God has asked us to do. And we talked last week about how rebellion isn't like just, these terrible things. Rebellion isn't like a season that a teenager goes through. Rebellion, isn't, when somebody chooses to, become a traitor towards their country or become a double agent. That's not just rebellion. But rebellion really is any small choice or decision we make to say no when God says go. So the way we described it last week is this. When God says go, rebellion says no. Would you say that with me on the count of 3? 1, 2, 3. When God says go, rebellion says no. And parents, you can use this little rhyme if you'd like with your kids. Like I'm beginning to do this with my 9-year-old. Emma, when Collin says go, rebellion says no. Like I'm just kind of working it in to our life. So go and get me the remote control. Like it's a really powerful moment in our home. I'm training my kids up in the way they ought to go. Like they're going to thank me for that and go to therapy. So really, as we think about this storyline, the story of Jonah kind of works this way, okay? Jonah, it's told by God to go to a people in the city of Nineveh. And he doesn't want to go to Nineveh because Nineveh is the capital city of the Assyrian Empire. The Assyrians hate the Israeli people. Jonah has known people that have lost their lives and become victims of the incredible, ruthless violence of the Assyrians. This is like no other message God has ever given his people. And so Jonah doesn't want to go, and so he does the direct opposite. Instead of going to Nineveh, Jonah jumps on a ship in Joppa. It goes 1,500 miles the opposite direction to the southern coast of Spain. He tries to run away from God, and as he tries to run away from God, in the middle of that, a storm begins to brew because, as the text says, God brings a storm. The sailors are so nervous. They believe that this storm is supernatural. The storm begins to brew. Jonah's in the bottom of the boat. He's eaten too much ice cream on the cruise ship. He's in like a little bit of a, cruise ship coma. They come to wake him up. They wake him up and they say, hey, pray to your God. We're all praying to our gods. And they're kind of doing this kind of shotgun approach, just praying to everything and anything, hoping the storm will stop. Eventually, they cast lots and they kind of, go to the, casino table and figure out who in the world is responsible for this. They find out that it's Jonah. They asked Jonah what he did. Jonah said he ran away from God. They turned to Jonah and say, why did you do that? Jonah said, because I didn't want to tell people who were not my people about God. And they're like, well, we're not your people and you're telling us about God. So it seems like you're doing the same thing, man, that you didn't want to do. And then after that, they said, well, what do we need to do to you? And Jonah says, throw me overboard. They don't want to throw him overboard. Jonah says, you need to throw me overboard. So they try to row really hard. They try to go against God. That doesn't work. So eventually they throw Jonah overboard. And then all of a sudden the sea comes to an end. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is your series recap. If I get an applause for that, the standard is really low. All right, Jonah chapter 1, verse 17 is where we're going to pick up, and this is what we find as we jump into the story. Now, the Lord provided a huge fish to swallow Jonah, and Jonah was in the belly of the fish 3 days and 3 nights. Now, we've got to pause here, right? Because if you're anything like me, you're asking questions, right? I'm wondering, where did this fish come from? How big is this fish? What kind of fish is it? And how can a person live in a fish for 3 days and 3 nights? Maybe these are the questions that you're asking. Is this story historical, or is this simply an allegory? Well, there's been debates about this for thousands of years now. But what's interesting is that the original readers and listeners of this story, they believed it to be true. And throughout the New Testament era as well, people believed it to be true as well. And I think there are two responses you and I can have to what seems to be somewhat supernatural and somewhat of a spectacle. The first one is this, that perhaps this was a natural event. What's really interesting is there are some studies and some research that shows that there are marine animals that are able to actually have a throat that is large enough to swallow a human being, and whose digestive process will not begin if the thing that's inside of their body is still alive. Now, when you hear 3 days and 3 nights, you got to understand that that's a colloquial term that was utilized in the ancient era. And 3 days and 3 nights could be as short a time period as 38 hours. We're not talking about a 72-hour experience necessarily, but perhaps a 38-hour one. And so while improbable, it may not be impossible that actually this was a natural event, that somehow in some way, shape, or form, all of the settings and circumstances were just right, that Jonah actually survived in the belly of a fish. The digestive process did not start. And as a result of this human being active in the body of the fish, eventually the fish would have to expel out what was there. That's kind of one perspective that can be taken. The second perspective is maybe it was just a unique miracle. Maybe this is something supernatural. Maybe this is something that is impossible, but yet it still happened. And here's why, for us, being modern people living in the 21st century, we've got to resonate with and at least reflect on the fact that it possibly being a miracle is an okay explanation. And here's the reason why, right? You and I probably know some people or have heard of stories of people who have gone into an exam and they've gotten a CT scan done or an MRI done, and it's very clear based upon what's on the chart and what's on the imaging that this person has a very, very sick disease. There's a real diagnosis and a real experience there. And then they go back a couple of weeks later, a couple of months later, they go and get a scan done, and the scan shows that what was there is no longer there. And I can't tell you how many times I've heard these stories or interacted with medical professionals myself who have said, let me tell you, there is no scientific explanation for what just happened. There must be something else at work here. And that could simply be the reality in the story of Jonah, is that there's a unique miracle that occurred. And either one of those responses is a fine response. For me personally, the way that I kind of work through this process and kind of get through my own skepticism and cynicism, of which I carry a decent bit, not just about this story, but just kind of things in general. I'm the kind of person that, like, when I see a commercial and I see somebody say that something got better in their life, I think it didn't, right? I'm that person, I'm that person who, you guys post all this stuff on social media about how your life has changed, and I'm like, sure, right? Like, I'm that person all of the time. I'm going to counseling for it, all right? It's a real thing, all right? But here's how I work this out in my own life, okay? I look at Jesus, and Jesus believed that the story of Jonah was history. And because Jesus believes that the story of Jonah was history, I just take Jesus at his word. And here's the reason why. Anyone that can predict their death, like Jesus did, declare their resurrection, which Jesus did, and then pull it off, to me, is someone worth following. I just go with whatever that guy says, right? So if it was good enough for Jesus, it's good enough for me, because there's way too much evidence to point to the fact that Jesus actually did what he did. And to know what he knew, to declare that it would happen a certain way, and then to pull it off the way that he did it, I just go with whatever that guy says. But maybe that's not compelling enough evidence for you, and that is really okay. What's so cool about our faith, and I would say what's unique about our faith, being a follower of Jesus, is that God is able to handle your doubt and wonder. He's not offended when you struggle to believe certain things. He's not upset that you won't take a story at face value. God is able and has full capacity to understand and to walk with you in the midst of your doubt and wonder. So regardless of where this story lands with you, there is good news for all of us, is that whether or not you believe the story to be allegory or history, the principles that are in play here are ultimately true, real, and no matter who you are and where you've been, you can resonate with them and see them as the way in which the creator of the universe tends to interact with us. Because Jonah's belly of the beast, bottom of the barrel moment, is not God's anger, but God's love toward him. What we'll find is that this fish that swallows Jonah is a story and a picture and an indicator that sometimes when things seem inconvenient, sometimes when things are uncomfortable, sometimes when life throws us a series of events that we would have never picked for ourselves, what seems on the surface to actually be God's punishment is actually God's grace and his kindness towards us. And here's good news. Is that if you're walking through difficulty, if you're walking through things that you would say, I don't want this to be true about my life, if you're walking through a situation that you wish was different and you are a follower of Jesus, there's really good news for you in the room today. That God disciplines those that he loves. That an indicator of the fact that you're with God is that you are walking through hard things because God actually allows those hard things to exist to build a relationship with you. Proverbs chapter 3, verse 11 and 12 put it this way. Proverbs is filled with some of the most wise pieces of literature ever. It's like an ancient Twitter, except with all the crazy stuff. And this is what Proverbs says. My child, don't reject the Lord's discipline and don't be upset when he corrects you. Not if, but when he corrects you. For the Lord corrects those he what? He loves. Just as a father corrects a child in whom he delights. A sign that God loves you and is for you and is pursuing your heart is that he allows difficult things to come into your life and he allows discipline to be a part of the story because he's forming and shaping you into who he ultimately wants you to be because he loves you too much to leave you where you are. And the principle that we learn in the story of Jonah is one that maybe you have resonated with before in your life, and you can give me a head nod if you've been here before. If you don't create space for you to listen to God, God will create it for you. Can I get a good Pentecostal amen, right? Like there's no doubt about that, right? We've all been there before in our life, in our journey, where we're kind of doing our own thing, living our own way, living in our suburban bliss, right? Kind of ignorant to the realities of everything around us, and then a diagnosis hits us, right? Or something happens in the workplace that we never expected, or a relationship goes sideways, or all of a sudden we find ourselves with way more time than we expected to have, or way more space to process and think about things. And that's exactly what happens to Jonah, is that Jonah gets to a point in his life after he's been doing things his way, where he recognizes in the midst of all of it, oh wait, I'm here because of me. And I'm here because God ultimately wants to have a conversation with me. Peter Craigie puts it this way. He says, it's not until Jonah was all the way down, finally stripped of his own, I love this phrase, buoyant self-sufficiency. Can we just stop there for a minute? I think that's so powerful. The idea that you and I have that we can keep ourselves afloat, right? I can do this on my own. I can do this on my own strength. At some point in the storyline, Jonah is going to be floating out in the ocean for a certain point of time. He's going to take on too much water. He's going to lose all of his strength. He's going to be utterly weak. And that's the point when he begins to drop and he takes his last breath and begins to sink into the ocean. And Craigie says, it's not until we let go of our buoyant self-sufficiency that deliverance is possible. It's not until we've fully acknowledged our weakness that we actually experience our rescue. So Jonah chapter 2, verse 1 through 2 kind of begins the storyline. Then Jonah prayed to the Lord his God from inside the fish. Now let's stop here for a minute, okay? Verse 17 tells us that he's swallowed by a fish and that he's been there for 3 days and 3 nights. Then Jonah, meaning it's on the 3rd day that Jonah begins to pray. Why? The first day, he probably thought, this is when I die, right? The second day, he was probably like, that was a mistake, right? The 3rd day, he wakes up and he's like, all right, I'm still here. I guess I should reach out to God. Now mind you, this isn't an irreligious man. This is a prophet. This is a man who in 2 Kings, right, is a part of building the great empire of Israel. He has been close to God his whole life. He's had a close relationship with God. And in the midst of his turmoil and in his greatest despair, it takes him 3 days to acknowledge God. Is that not like me and you sometimes? Like it's until he gets to the end of his rope that he finally waves the white flag. And he says, I called out to the Lord out of my distress, and he answered me out of the belly of Sheol. I cried, and you heard my voice. Now we need to stop here. In Jonah chapter 2, verses 1 through 9, what we're going to see is a poem. And this is really important to get. is that what we're going to read in the next couple of verses is the emotional process that Jonah goes through that are not the exact words that Jonah said while he was in the belly of the fish, okay? This is after the story. He writes a poem. It's way too poetic for it to be something that he said while he was in the belly of a fish, if you're tracking with me. It's not like he had a little candle, had a little piece of papyrus and like an old ancient pen and began to write this poem inside the belly. That's not what happens, okay? This is him looking back at this particular moment of his life. And he says, out of the belly of Sheol, meaning Sheol is the word of like Hades, is another way of thinking about it. Hell, it's complete disconnection from God. He's saying, in my pit of despair, at the bottom of the barrel, when there was nothing going for me, when my life was not worth anything and I thought it was over, when I was at the end of my rope, he said, I cried out and you heard my voice. Now this is important. Jonah was only willing to obey God to the degree he agreed with God's decisions. And that's why he's in the belly of a fish. You get that? Like if you had to think through the process, how did Jonah get to this point? Like how did Jonah get to this point of despair? How did Jonah get to this point of being utterly cast to the bottom of the ocean? I mean, think about the journey that this man has gone on. He's gone from being one of the most well-known and well-respected people in the empire to now being in the belly of a fish in obscurity, thinking this is where he loses his life. All because he was unwilling to go when God said go. All because he said no when God said go. Now, for you and I, Nineveh isn't, our thing, right? Like we don't have like a city necessarily that we don't want to go to. Although for some of you, I know that it's, other cities in Orlando that I won't mention because you might be from there and I don't want to offend you, all right? But what's interesting about Jonah is that he had a place to go that he said no to, which led to this point of despair. And you and I are going to have places that God calls us to go to that if we say no are going to lead to our pit of despair as well. And for you and I, our Nineveh might just be our way that we think about romance. The way that we think about romance and relationship is not God's way, it's our way. And here's what I would submit to you. Anytime we do it our way instead of God's way, we're inviting storms into our life that ultimately will lead to pits of despair. So maybe for us, it has to do with the way we think about relationships and romance. And the reason why you find yourself in pit of despair after pit of despair after pit of despair, even in your marriage, right, is because you continue to make choices about how you're going to do relationships your way instead of God's way. Because your way makes more sense. Your way is more convenient. Your way is more comfortable. But it leads to these belly of the fish moments. And that's why you're married but really glorified roommates right now. That's why you haven't extended forgiveness, because forgiveness is hard, and who wants to do that? And as a result of that, the grudge that family. Or maybe it has to do with the way that we think about generosity or our resources. We're doing it our way instead of God's way. And so we look at the turmoil we are in financially and think, my goodness, how in the world am I ever going to lift myself up, right, out of the debt that I'm carrying or out of the weight of what I'm feeling financially? And the reason why you're in the boat that you're in is because you did it your way instead of God's way. And you thought your way was better than God's way. And as a result of that, you find yourself where you are. Or maybe for you it has to do with your family. Maybe there's a reality that God's got a destiny for your kid, but it's not the dream that you had for them. And you find yourself constantly boxing God out of the relationship with your kid because you want them to be a certain way. So you're spending tons of money on Kumon and tons of money on, extracurricular sports, and you're finding ways to manipulate the coach so that they can get on the best teams. You're doing everything you can, right? And for some of us, it's because we're advocating for our kids, but for others of us, the reason why we're doing this is because we want to live vicariously through our kids. And we want to protect them from pain. And the result of that is we're actually right now raising the least resilient generation in American history because we're protecting our kids from too much instead of allowing them to engage in the real world. And we're doing it our way instead of God's way. Or maybe God's invitation to us is to take a day of rest every week and to not work. And for you and I, we're choosing not to live that way. So we are sacrificing our family and sacrificing our health and sacrificing our relationships on the altar of work. Not because we want to necessarily provide for the family, but because it's where we get our security and our validity and our value and our significance. Because what would we do if we just had a day when we didn't do those things? Let's be real. If it's your relationships, if it's your finances, if it's your family, or if it's your work life. Sometimes it takes bottoming out or burning out before we realize that we're in a prison we built by ourselves. Sometimes it takes being let go to realize, you know what, I was way too loyal to a company than I ever should have been. Sometimes it takes the blow-up fight at home to recognize, man, the way that we've actually been trying to relate with our kids is not helpful or healthy for them at all. Sometimes it takes being in such a financial position of debt and need and getting calls from the creditors all day long and running back and forth trying to rob Peter to pay Paul to get the extra job and pick up the side hustle to make everything work, that we have to realize, man, the stress and anxiety and worry I'm carrying on my life is nobody else's fault but my own. But can we be honest? Isn't it way easier to blame somebody else for our situations than to take responsibility for our own reality? Yeah, which is exactly what Jonah did. Look at verse 3, okay? And laugh with me as you look at Jonah. But as you laugh, realize that you're laughing at yourself. This is Jonah chapter 3, okay? He turns to God and he says, "You threw me into the ocean depths, and I sank down to the heart of the sea." Like, can you hear the little violin playing? "The mighty waters engulfed me. I was buried beneath your wild and stormy waves. Then I said, 'Oh Lord, you have driven me from your presence.'" According to Jonah, whose fault is it that he's in the belly of a fish? It's God's, right? "God, you threw me off the boat." Whoa, hold up, mate, all right? Who decided to go down to Joppa? Jonah. Who decided to get on the boat? Jonah. Who decided not to obey God? Jonah. Who told the sailors to throw him off the boat? Jonah, right? But Jonah's saying the reason why he's in the situation he's in is because of something that God did to him. And then he goes as far to say, "God, you have driven me from your presence." He doesn't recognize that the fish that he's in is actually God's provision for him. He sees all of this as God's fault. And let's be honest, okay? Some of us do the same thing. We think the reason why our relationship isn't working out is because it's God's fault. No, it might just be because of you. We think the reason why we're not in a stronger financial position is because God's not providing and the business keeps on holding us down and we can't get the promotion. Maybe the reason why those blessings are not coming your way is because of your own choices not to do it God's way. And God loves you too much to give you something that's going to enable behavior on your part that's detrimental to your own soul. Maybe the reason why we're in the situation we're in is not because God put us there, but because we built that prison ourselves, and God in his grace is finding a way to work in the midst of our stupidity to give us a sense of redemption. And then Jonah turns. And I think in this moment, this is when the game changes for him. And I think in this moment, it's when the game changes for us. Jonah, in the midst of this despair and anger and frustration towards God, finally says what needs to be said. He says, "Yet I will look once more towards your holy temple." Now, as 21st century readers, we don't necessarily understand the value of this, but anybody in the ancient times who was hearing this story or reading this story would have understood the momentous occasion of what has just occurred. Because for the people who were reading this text, the holy temple was a sign and a picture of God's presence. So what Jonah is saying here is, I'm done saying it's your fault, God. I am going to turn my attitude towards you. The holy temple was the sign of God's presence for the people during that day. King Solomon, when he designed and architected this beautiful temple and eventually prayed over it, says this in 1 Kings 8:29. This is his prayer. His prayer for all of the Hebrew people. He said, "May you watch over this temple night and day, this place where you have said, my name will be there," meaning God's presence is here. "May you also hear the prayers I make toward this place." So catch this. For Jonah, turning back to the temple meant turning back to the presence of God. It's at the pit of despair. It's when he's at the end of his rope, when he's at the bottom of the barrel, when he's done everything he could do, when the buoyancy of his self-sufficiency has fallen flat, that he finally says, "God, I need you." He waves the white flag. And here's what you and I need to know, is that this is life for us. That life for us is going to be a consistent back and forth in this process of doing things our way and recognizing that the reason why we're in the mess we're in is because we've been doing it our way. So the question then is, how do we realize and what do we do once we realize we've been running? How do we return once we realize we've been running? I want to give you 3 principles today we find in this story that if we apply to our life, whether or not we're currently in a pit of despair moment or if we're going to enter into one into the future, because I promise you, Jonah ran one time, I'd run every day, all right? I don't know about you, but I find myself doing things my way instead of God's day every day. So what's the process that we need to walk through once we realize that we've been running? How do we return well? Here's the first one. Write this down. Recognize your difficulty as God's grace. Recognize your difficulty as God's grace. Jonah 2, 5, and 6. He says, I sank beneath the waves, and the waters closed over me. Seaweed wrapped itself around my head. I sank down to the very roots of the mountains. This is what he's saying prior to the fish. I was imprisoned in the earth, whose gates locked shut forever, meaning he was going black. He was sinking down to the depths of the ocean. This is game over. This is how his story ends. And then he writes, but you, O Lord, my God, snatched me from the jaws of death. Here's the pivotal moment. Jonah recognized the fish wasn't God's punishment, but God's provision. That the thing that seemed most inconvenient, the thing that was most difficult in his life in that moment was not God's punishment of him, but actually God's provision. And this is so important, right? Because here's what you need to know if you're a follower of Jesus, is that God is not out there with a big lightning stick, like ready to just blow you up when you do something wrong. He works through our stupidity to create and give us an opportunity for redemption. But sometimes the way that redemption comes is not the way that we want it to come. You tracking? Like let's just kind of get a good example of this, all right? Wouldn't it have been better for Jonah as he was sinking down for God to show up and for angels and light and glory to pick him up and lift him up out of the water and just like walk him to the shore? Anybody signing up for that one instead, right? Like there are countless ways that God could have saved Jonah except for a fish, right? But here's what God knew about Jonah, is that Jonah needed the belly of a fish moment to be reminded of how good God was. And you and I don't know what we need, but God does all of the time, and he gives us exactly what we need when we need it, because what we need is ultimately what God desires for us. Jonah recognized the fish wasn't God's punishment, but his provision. What would be different about your life if you recognize that the no that you got to that promotion was actually God's protection of you? Or the relationship that started and then stopped was actually God's protection of you? Or the hard thing that you're going through that you wish you weren't going through is actually God's provision for you because it's drawing you closer to him. My grandmother is in a season of life right now where she is not able to do a lot physically. And we don't know why. We've looked at a variety of diagnoses, and we just cannot figure out what's going on with her. And you need to know this about my grandmother. She's an incredible woman who is incredibly active and has been active her whole life. I mean, she gets up before the sun, rises, and she's in her garden, and then she's, building something, and then she's making something else. I mean, this woman, like, if we went to, go work out, a couple of years ago, if we went to a spin class, she would kick my tail. If we went to Orange Theory, she'd have more splat points. If we went to CrossFit, she would kick my tail on the board. And if you're like, I don't know about spin class, Orange Theory, or CrossFit, thank God that you don't, all right? Because they are terrible experiences, all right? But my grandmother would be able to do all of those things. And now she's in a position where she can't. It's hard for her to get from her bed to the kitchen and back. I was talking to her on the phone recently just about how she's processing that. And she said, son, it's so good for me to go through this weakness right now because I'm realizing how much God is there in the midst of it and how much I need him. There's a young woman in our church who I was talking to recently, and she said, the way that I'm beginning to think about life is that a blessing is anything that makes me need God. A blessing isn't just the good things that come. It's anything in my life that makes me need God. Imagine if our life would look different. Imagine how our perspective would change if we recognized and embraced the difficulty that we're in. Maybe it's the fact that we're a multi-family home and we're trying to figure this out. Maybe that's God's blessing. Maybe God can redeem that. Maybe it's the fact that you're co-parenting right now and you never wish that situation, but that's the situation in. Maybe there's God's blessing there. Maybe you wish that you were in a relationship and you're not in a relationship right now. Maybe that's God's blessing. Maybe you wish you were making more money, but maybe more money would actually erode your soul. And so God's protecting you from that, and you can see that as his kindness and provision to you. Here's the second one. Remember your need for saving and surrender. This is the hardest one for me. Because I don't like to feel like I need to be saved, and I don't like to surrender. But I need it. Two things I can't figure out in life by my own. How to get right with God, can't do it on my own. And how to solve all of my problems because I have too many, and I usually get it wrong when I try it on my own. Jonah 2:7 says this, as my life was slipping away, I remembered the Lord, and my earnest prayer, meaning from the depth of his soul, it was real. My earnest prayer went out to you in your holy temple. I love how Tim Keller talks about this in his book, The Prodigal Prophet. He comments on verse 7 and he says this, that it is only when you reach the very bottom, when everything falls apart, when all your schemes and resources are broken and exhausted, that you are finally open to learning, I love this phrase, how to completely depend on God. As it is often said, you never realize that Jesus is all you need until Jesus is all you have. Which begs this question. I want you to process it. Process it with your community group. Process it when you go to a men's or women's study. Process it at home over lunch. But am I fully surrendered to Jesus in everything? Completely. My concern is that for some of us, our faith is like we surrender to Jesus in certain places but not in others. And as a result of that, we experience some of God's grace on our life, but we don't experience the fullness of it. Now, hear what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that the pathway to experiencing Jesus' salvation is through surrender. That until you and I wave the white flag in every area and aspect of our life, we will not experience surrender in the places that we have not yet surrendered to Jesus. We will not experience salvation or rescue in the places that we have not surrendered to Jesus. So for some of us, our relationships are a mess because we're doing it God's way in other ways, but we're doing it our way here, and we're not experiencing rescue there. And God wants to intersect into that space and meet you in the middle of it. For some of us, it has to do with our work rhythm. We look at our life and think about how much we're doing with work, and we feel so much stress and so much worry and so much anxiousness. We're losing sleep. Our health is a mess, and we're not experiencing the rescue of Jesus because we haven't surrendered, that he knows what's best. And if we do it his way instead of our way, maybe he'll provide for us in a different way or a better way. And maybe we won't have to exhaust ourselves as much. Are you fully surrendered to Jesus in everything? Or have you simply paid him lip service in some things? Here's the last one. Replace your way with the way of Jesus. We talk about this phrase a lot at our church, the way of Jesus. The way of Jesus is a lifestyle that Jesus invites us into. But the good news of Jesus is not that we have a get out of hell free card if we just put our faith and trust in him, but that Jesus' invitation is actually to impact every single moment of our life. That he gives us a pattern of living that if we follow it, we will find rest for our soul. That's the promise that he gives us. And the first two principles we've looked at, these are perspectives. This is orienting our heart and mind around really embracing and surrendering to God. But there's a moment when the rubber has to hit the road, right? And what we believe here and here actually has to hit our hands, our feet, our schedules, our bank accounts, and the way that we relate to others. And that's what Jonah concludes. He says this in verses 8 and 9. He said, those who worship false gods turn their backs on all God's mercies, meaning those who choose to pursue everything except what God has called them to, those who pursue their way instead of God's way in any particular place. Whenever I choose my way instead of God's way, I turn my back on God's favor and blessing. So all I can do is what I can pull off on my own, instead of having access to everything that God can provide to make the biggest difference. And Jonah says, but instead, I'm going to do it different. He said, I will offer sacrifices to you with songs of praise. And look at this phrase. I will fulfill all my vows. For my salvation comes from the Lord alone. He recognizes not only the rescue for his soul, but the rescue in his day-to-day life in every aspect comes from God and God alone. Which leads us to this reality, that we will bend our knee to God or the idol of me. That we're made to worship something. And it'll either be me pursuing my way as a means of comfort and security and power and approval, only to find myself in a pit of despair one day and in one moment. Or I will bend my knee in full surrender to Jesus, saying, God, I will do it your way. Ultimately, what Jonah says in verse 8 and 9 is this, that I will do it God's way, and I will do it all the way. That there's not an ounce of my life that God cannot examine. That there's not an ounce of my life that will not be surrendered to his way of relationships, his way of resources, his way of family, his way of work, his way of priorities and values. Because ultimately, Jesus' invitation to be our Savior involves our surrendering all to him. Not to just save us from eternity away from him, but to save us into joy with him today. And it's not until this point, when Jonah finally comes to this realization, that we find this in verse 10, Then the Lord ordered the fish to spit Jonah out onto the beach. And that's where we'll pick up next week. In the meantime, I want to challenge you with this. I want to challenge you with some really, really good news. That God has patience with our running and returning because Jesus obeyed perfectly in our place. Man, if you're anything like me, I don't just run from Nineveh one time in my life. I run from Nineveh every day in my life. That I find myself doing things my way because my way is easier, my way makes more sense to me, and my way makes me feel comfortable. And that in the midst of doing it my way, God deposits and reminds me, hey, the way that you're doing this is not going to lead you to where you want to be, so why don't you do it God's way instead? And when I find myself doing it my way, I just find great joy and peace and rest in knowing it's never been about me doing it the right way that makes me right before God. Because Jesus did it the right way for me all the way so that all the time I can know, regardless of what mistakes I make, regardless of where I fall short, God's love for me has never been about my performance. It's always been about what Jesus has performed for me on my behalf. Which gives us freedom, doesn't it? It gives us freedom to look at our life and think, you know what, I'm going to struggle with this every day of my life, and that's okay. Because I'm a work in process. And God is okay with the journey. So today, let me leave you with this question. What do you need to surrender so you can experience Jesus as Savior? For some of you, you need to surrender your life because you've never done it. For others of you, it's, hey, I'm a follower of Jesus and I'm trying to walk in his way, but I need to surrender the way that I think about relationships. Or I need to surrender the way I think about resources. Or I need to surrender the way I think about work. I need to surrender the way I think about provision. I need to surrender the way I think about priorities. And I need to get in alignment with Jesus. And let's be honest, some of us already know what that thing is, right? It's like that little thing that we hide in the corner that we say, hey, I'm going to serve you in every other place, God. Just let me keep this little thing. But God loves you too much to keep that little thing because that little no will lead to the big storms in your life that will ultimately lead to the pits of despair that God wants to rescue you from. He loves you too much to leave you that way. Maybe another way of describing this question is, where is God inviting you to depend on him instead of yourself? And the good news is that Jonah suffered because of his rebellion. Where Jonah suffered because of his rebellion, Jesus suffered because of ours. That he wasn't the only guy to spend 3 days and 3 nights in the pit of despair. But Jesus spent 3 days and 3 nights in a tomb of despair, taking on all of our shame, all of our sin, and all of our regret, and leaving into that tomb. So that on the third day, when he would rise and walk out, we could bury once and for all of our shame, all of our regret, and all of our sin, knowing that there is newness of life in Jesus. That our rebellion has been taken care of on the cross by Christ. And today is a new day with new hope and new life. Would you pray with me?